The main point for Nietzsche is that the pleasure we took in making somebody suffer, we find it again into this idea of making oneself suffer.
Welcome to Unpacking Ideas, the podcast where each episode we unpack an influential piece of writing from the past in order to make it more accessible in the present. Today we're looking at the second essay in the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. Last episode we covered the first essay in episode 28, so if you want to go back and listen to that one, you'll have a fuller understanding of the ideas discussed here, but it's not absolutely necessary. I think that most of the content, most of the ideas are still going to make sense even if you haven't heard that episode and aren't familiar with Nietzsche's ideas already. Today, helping me unpack this essay was Samuel Coutour. We talked about a lot of stuff. We got into Nietzsche's ideas on the origins and utility of punishment, the creditor-debtor relationship, the pleasure in punishing, the link between social status and sadism, forgiveness as a form of domination, the state of nature theory, turning one's instincts on oneself, ancestor worship, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, original sin, the psychology of guilt, and the sovereign individual. This was another just super fascinating piece. Nietzsche at his best, questioning fundamental assumptions that we have. So I got a lot out of this. Samuel was great, really super grateful to him for helping me cut through the weeds on this one. I hope that you get a lot of value out of this, and here it is, my conversation with Samuel on the second essay in the Genealogy of Morals. We're here to talk about essay 2, which is guilt, bad conscience, and related matters. Yeah, this is a particular interest to me. I feel like I have a lot of guilt, maybe just my Catholic upbringing, but so this was helping me unpack some of my Catholic guilt.
Everybody is supposed to have some, according to Nietzsche in some way, like bad conscience triumphed. So we are all in it. It's our problem.
Right. Is it a French thing too much? Is there French guilt? The French seem pretty laid back.
We could do a whole podcast on it.
Oh, really?
Well, I don't know. It's a good question. No, man, I think there's a lot of French
guilt.
French guilt. Yeah.
I just have this American conception of just really relaxed about sexuality and no guilt and just smoking in cafes. But
no, I think we have a lot of guilt of. I don't know exactly why, but like French people are really unsatisfied with themselves, I guess. I don't know about France in general. They're always complaining about it. I don't know.
Gotcha. Like inferiority.
I don't know. Yeah. Kind of superiority, inferiority dynamic. I don't know.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. So in this essay, we're going to kind of go through it like we went through the first one. First kind of talking about what questions Nietzsche's trying to answer here. And he states pretty explicitly in chapter 4 of this essay, he says, how is it that bad conscience came into the world? And I think this is the main question he's trying to answer, kind of what are the origins of bad conscience?
Yeah, so bad conscience, what Nietzsche calls bad conscience is actually the psychologically, the phenomenon of bad conscience expresses itself in guilt. Like, is it the very fact of feeling guilty? So the question of Nietzsche is, where does guilt come from? Like, why do we feel guilty, and what it is the symptom of? And usually when we feel guilt, we're like, oh, I'm guilty. That means I feel I should be punished.
Yeah.
And so one main assumption could be like, oh, so if I feel that I should be punished for guilt, that might be because the origin of guilt is punishment. Like,
right.
Like, yeah, the normal assumption will be like, some guys in the past just punished us so many times over a generation that we just understood and learned that for this particular act, this requires punishment and that we should be punished for that.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of one of the kind of false assumptions that he wants to bust, is that punishment doesn't necessarily lead to bad conscience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's something we go a bit too quick in our thinking when we think about that, because actually when we think about it, there's no necessarily link. Like, we could, if we are punished over the generation, we could learn that we are probably getting punished for this particular act. Like, if I kill somebody, I learn over the generation that I get punished for that. But there's something more in saying that we deserve to be punished. There's something moral here that is absolutely not necessary. Like, where does it come from that not only we know that we are certainly going to be punished by the state, by the police, by the laws and everything, but that we deserve it? That is something that would necessarily comes from the fact itself that if you kill, you deserve to be punished, and that therefore the law is just. And like, so this is where the origin of punishment is not necessarily its function. Like, nowadays we feel that like guilt is really related with the idea of punishment, but like the idea of Nietzsche is that maybe it was not the case, and that at the origin there is something more obscure about why do we feel that we deserve to be punished when we do something that is just forbidden.
Totally. Well, so there's two ideas in there that maybe we can draw attention to. The first is kind of this fallacy that a lot of us have to kind of look at maybe like the current utility of something and then conclude that, oh, that must be its origin. And he talks a lot about that throughout. And maybe I'll read a quote or two of him talking about this. He says, quote, "The origin of the existence of a thing and its final utility are tot quel opposed to each other. Everything, anything which exists and which prevails anywhere will always be put to new purposes by a force superior to itself, will be commandeered afresh, will be turned and transformed to new uses." And he uses the example of punishment here, of how, this, just because punishment now is used for all of these certain things like deterrence and whatnot, we can't therefore jump to the conclusion, therefore, the origins of punishment were to, cause guilt in the person being punished. Yeah.
Maybe we could quote the passage in Nietzsche where he lists the whole function of punishment. I don't know if you have it.
I do. Yeah. Give me
like that would give a good example of how punishment is like you could have many functions.
Totally. Okay, so these are all the kind of possible utilities of punishment. Punishment as rendering the criminal harmless and incapable of further injury. Punishment as compensation for the injury sustained by the injured party in any form whatsoever. Punishment as an isolation of that which disturbs the equilibrium so as to prevent the further spreading of the disturbance. Punishment as a means of inspiring fear of those who determine and execute the punishment. Punishment as a kind of compensation for advantages which the wrongdoer has up to that in time enjoyed. Punishment as the elimination of an element of decay. And then he goes on for another half of the page. So, but yeah, the idea there's so many different utilities for punishment.
Yeah, and guilt is absolutely not the first one and the more essential for Nietzsche. Because, and here he agrees with Spinoza, there's this idea that at the beginning, when someone gets punished, guilt is absolutely not the first consequence. Like, you have much more guilt in a priest in a monastery, for instance, than in somebody in a prison. Like the criminal that is who is punished, the serial killer.
He doesn't feel bad at all.
Probably doesn't feel as much guilt as the priest in his monastery that never killed anybody.
Right.
The very fact of punishing doesn't make you feel guilty. It makes you more intelligent, maybe, because next time you are not getting caught. It makes you more hard, more tough, more strong in some way. Like this is some kind of hypothesis Nietzsche gives. But it's very strange that if you think about it, you think about punishment. There's like the link between punishment and guilt is really not necessary and is even a bit strange.
Well, and on that point, he says, speaking generally, punishment hardens and numbs. It produces concentration. It sharpens the consciousness of alienation. It strengthens the power of resistance.
Yeah, and I think we all have in our childhood some memories about us getting caught by our parents, and instead of being really guilty, being like, oh, like having the feeling of just getting caught and be like, oh,
I need to do better next time not to get caught. Yeah.
I should have lied, or I should have
Right.
done something else, but like
Yeah.
not really feeling guilty, feeling, oh, I deserved it. Like it's just, oh, I get caught, and that's
Right.
that's too bad. But still, we have this impression, like this strong inner evidence that guilt is related to punishment. So the real question is, why do we feel that guilt is related to punishment?
Yeah.
Whereas actually, historically, when we look at it, it has nothing to do with it, or not necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is
Exactly.
the main question we're trying to answer with Nietzsche today.
Cool. So then I think that leads us into the etymology. So again, as a philologist, Nietzsche's going to want to kind of take a historical look at this and say, well, what if we go back and look at the origins of the word guilt and kind of see how it was used at different points in history? And he talks about this German word schuld, which means to owe.
Schuldig means guilty, and Schuld means literally debt, like the debt. Yeah.
Yeah. So then he kind of talks about this creditor-debtor relationship and how this relates to kind of our understanding of guilt and punishment. Yeah.
You think that the very notion of responsibility, of personal responsibility, comes from the creditor-debtor relation. Like you have a credit, a creditor, a debtor, and if the debtor is not able to repay the creditor the amount he gave him with interest or anything, then he's punished in some way.
Yeah.
Like he can be harmed, he can be hit, he can become a slave.
Yeah.
He
Sell
can
their
lose
children
his
into slavery.
house, his children, his wife. These are kinds of things that have existed, for instance, in the antiquity. So Nietzsche believed that in the center, in the core of this creditor-debtor relation, and of the core then of the idea of responsibility, there is this idea of an equivalent between a damage,
Right.
and the harm done to somebody that could compensate it. Like the debtor damages the creditor by not repaying him, and this damage can be compensated by the harm you do to the debtor, like the creditor does to the debtor. Yeah.
Well, and then from there you can kind of ask the question, like, okay, if I lend you money and you can't pay me back or don't pay me back, and then I, get even with you by punching you in the face, how does that make us even?
Yeah.
And I think Nietzsche would answer, because I, as the person who punched you, derive some joy from that. It's pleasurable. It's pleasurable to punch
but
you.
that's what's strange.
Yeah.
Like Nietzsche is like, this is very strange to like. He seems to believe, like, this is a strange belief to believe, like, to think that you could compensate a damage by just making somebody suffer. And as you
Right.
said, it's the proof that there must be some pleasure in the very fact of punishing.
Yeah.
And like this is kind of strange actually, because it doesn't compensate logically.
Right.
It's not supposed to compensate. Like if somebody, I don't know,
Like
stole,
I still don't have my $10.
yeah. Like you just hit me. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't. But like somehow
It makes it even.
Yeah.
So then I think we take it a step further and say, well, why does the person who harms the other derive pleasure from it, and why does it even the debt?
And just before that, I would like to add that as Nietzsche says it, like if you look throughout history, like there was a time where having a feast, having a big party in town, you should have some cruelty in it. Like you should have some people to sacrifice, something cruel to do. Like cruelty was really part of the feast of the. So it's not only like a psychological hypothesis. Like it's also like historically, like if you think about gladiators in the Rome,
sure.
like cruelty was really a feast, and suffering. Like today, suffering is like Nietzsche say as moderns, we see suffering as something that goes against the value of life, against what makes sense in life. But for many people in their history, cruelty was making life more joyful, like was making life more exciting. So there was some pleasure. And as you said, the reason is like why
Why
is
is there
so?
pleasure?
And
Yeah.
there's many reasons for that, actually.
Yeah.
Like Nietzsche is not giving one specific reason, but he's giving one that is pretty convincing. It is that doing harm to somebody, it's a privilege. Like it's something that when you do harm to somebody, you're kind of you raise yourself above him as in the social status. And this is why one of the current punishment could be like one of the very common punishment could be like enslave somebody, because it's really enact the social state, your social status. To be able to do harm to somebody is to prove that you're above him,
Right.
like in a certain way. So it's kind of a social.
Yeah, humans are driven largely by status, and punishing somebody, you're kind of asserting your dominance over them in a certain way. You're kind of pushing them down. And he says, quote, to put the question yet again, why can suffering be a compensation for owing? Because the infliction of suffering produces the highest degree of happiness, because the injured party will get in exchange for his loss an extraordinary counter pleasure, the infliction of suffering, a real feast.
And the pleasure is even greater when you have a lot at stake in the social stages. I mean, if you're a big emperor, for instance, and you punish a slave, this doesn't bring you a lot of pleasure because you already know that you're...
It also doesn't bring you a lot of status.
Yeah. But if you are punishing somebody who is above you in the social status, for instance, then it brings a lot of pleasure. That's what Nietzsche say. The higher the gap between the higher the gap between the one who punish and the one who is punished, the greater the pleasure.
Right.
Because suddenly you rise above somebody that was supposed to be above you in the social stratification.
Yeah, so kind of along those lines, we also have this idea that the stronger the creditor is, the less pleasure they will derive in the punishment, or the less need they will even feel to punish, to the point where if the creditor becomes so strong or so powerful, they might not punish at all.
Yeah.
And this
definitely.
is what he refers to as grace.
Yeah. Like if we take again this example of the emperor and the slave, the emperor feels no power to punish the slave. It's like very obvious that it is his right in the antiquity, for instance. And but he could take pleasure in not punishing him. Like people, he's supposed to do so, but he can also show his power in not punishing him, showing that even if the slave did something wrong, or like he doesn't feel attacked by it, endangered by him as a social power. So he just let him go. Like that's grace, and that's in somehow. If we feel pleasure in grace, if you feel this kind of superiority, it means that grace is a certain kind of punishment, but more subtle. Like I think this is what Nietzsche is trying to say also later in the text. He's trying to show that in not punishing, this is a more subtle form of punishing also, because you create in the other a lot of grateful feeling of feeling, oh, my great emperor, oh, you didn't pay me, so so you have to admit that he's superior to you, because he could have done it had he didn't. Like, oh, he's so great.
Right. Well, I even think of that the term be the bigger person.
Yeah.
In that way, usually we think of that as a good thing. Like, okay, like be the bigger person, like don't retaliate or don't punish the person back. But in a way, being the bigger person and basically not punishing the person who is indebted to you, you are kind of asserting your dominance over them in a kind of moral way.
I mean, it works if it is obvious that you could punish somebody. Like, if people doubt that you could have punished this guy, and you're just like, oh, I'm just greater than that. Like, you feel that this is not the case. This is what we talked about in the first section. It's more about like turning your weakness into virtue. But like, if it's obvious that you could punish a guy and that you don't do it, like here you're just so much superior than if you would have punished him. Because if you punish him, it also shows that you needed this kind of social status, this social confirmation. Whereas if you don't, it means that you already have it.
Yeah, and we've kind of been talking about this creditor-debtor relationship on kind of an individual level. but I think it might be worthwhile to kind of spell it out how this plays out on more of a societal level as well, because my understanding as well is there's also kind of this debtor creditor relationship between the individual and society.
Yeah.
In that the individual is kind of a debtor to society, in the sense that society is giving the individual all of these things like security, resources,
health,
health,
education.
right? In return for the individual to not break the law, in a sense. And this is the kind of like social contract that a lot of great philosophers have written about. But in this way, we can also see as the society becomes stronger and more powerful, the need to punish the individual who breaks the laws goes down.
Yeah, this is Nietzsche's. Yeah, he imagines a society like that, who is strong enough not to punish.
And he says, quote, "It is possible to conceive of a society blessed with so great a consciousness of its own power as to indulge in the most aristocratic luxury of letting its wrongdoers go scot-free. What do my parasites matter to me, might society say. Let them live and flourish. I am strong enough for it."
Yeah, this is kind of a idealistic state, but like, I don't know if it's possible, but like, yeah, this is what we told about grace, actually. It's like just grace applied to the whole society.
It makes me kind of think about democratic societies, and as a society or a state becomes more and more powerful, basically it's able to withstand more and more people to break the law without society just becoming completely chaotic.
Yeah.
And so I would be curious if Nietzsche would kind of see like this movement away from cruel and unusual punishment, this movement away from capital punishment, as an indicator of how strong the state has become.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Like, it would make sense. But I still think that, like, I don't know if society could really stop thinking that they can be overthrown. Any power can stop thinking to be overthrown in a certain way that it lets everybody. Because as soon as you let some antagonist forces develop, then the fear just reappears. I don't know if it's personally, I'm not very like, this is theoretically a good example of what is the logic of punishment. Like, it is not like the strongest the society, the stronger the punishment. No, actually, there in some degrees you can imagine a society becomes more easygoing with criminality and yeah, as a sign of its force. But like, to go to the extreme point of not punishing anybody, I think it's just
sure.
But it gives a good insight of what logic Nietzsche is describing here. But in any case, I think what we have to to keep in mind from this first, these are the first sections of the book, is that in the creditor-debtor relation, the creditor doesn't punish because the debitor deserve it. Because the debitor should have done it otherwise, or not even because the debitor could have done it otherwise.
Right.
It's because he missed, he couldn't repay, and so he gave the creditor the right, the privilege, the social status to have the right to have no pity for him and to enjoy his suffering, which is like a kind of a royal privilege.
Right.
So this is at the beginning, and this is the big point of Nietzsche. Punishment has nothing to do with free will, of the idea that, oh, I could have done otherwise, and therefore I should have done otherwise. So it has nothing and this is where guilt. This is where guilt happens. Is when you have a free will and you could have done otherwise, but you didn't, and you should, and you keep thinking about it. So Nietzsche is trying to bring the origin of the early days of punishment as a non-guilty thing, as something really without any idea of free will. So then if we add Nietzsche's question again, punishment cannot be the origin of guilt.
Yeah. So maybe we can start talking about his hypothesis. So I might actually just read this quote because it kind of spells out his hypothesis. He starts with, This is in chapter 16, quote, "My hypothesis concerning the origin of the bad conscience. I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness which man was bound to contract under the stress of the most radical change which he has ever experienced. That change when he found himself finally imprisoned within the pale of society and of peace. Just like the plight of the water animals when they were compelled either to become land animals or to perish, so was the plight of these half animals, perfectly adapted as they were to the savage life of war, prowling and adventure. Suddenly all their instincts were rendered worthless and switched off."
Yeah. So, yeah, this is the classical philosophical problem of the state of nature, actually. Like, how do you come from, like, a natural way of living with, like, everybody just exerting its will to power
and their animal instincts, yeah,
to a place where, obviously, to live in a society, you have to forbid that.
Right.
And this is a big change. And Nietzsche is comparing that with the first animals from the sea
to come onto land.
Who came on the land. Like, they had a lot of organs of they had a body that would fit to the first state, to the sea, and one day they just land on the beach and suddenly all their body doesn't fit for the new environment, and so they have a big anxiety, a big weight on their shoulder, be like, oh, we need to change that. And then they have a lot of energy that they cannot deploy anymore. And Nietzsche believed that at some point in the humanity, the same anxiety was like, oh, now we live in a society and we're used to ride all over the meadows and the mountains and everything, and now we just have to stay in our homes and not kill anybody who is doing something that we disagree with. So actually, it's the problem of the state.
Yeah. Well, and in a way, the kind of example of the water animals going onto land, like, it's a much more gradual process as well. Like, that happened over millions of years. Whereas the transition from this state of nature into civilization, he doesn't give us a lot of specifics, but as we kind of know from history, it definitely wasn't a process of millions of years. It was very kind of sudden, where, you know, we still had, and I'm talking in past tense, we still have a lot of these kind of what he would call kind of animalistic instincts that want to express themselves and, you know, can't.
At some point there's a transition that has to appear between, like, we could say a nomad way of living where exteriority is the main way of expressing its will to power, like against people, against animals. And when you come to live in a city, for instance, where here you have to, like, the rules are still very different, and you have to express your will to power in a very different way. And it's true that at some point the humanity has to learn that, like, this is not something natural. Like, so we had to learn to live in a city and to live with a state. And when we say to live with a state, Nietzsche is very clear that it is not the state as we understand it in the modern way. Like, the state, what he means by the state is just a couple of blonde beasts, as he called them, like, of pure aristocrat that just one day arrived and decided to gather the people together and make them live in the same place under the same rules. So this is not the state in the modern sense, with, like, an army, a government, an assembly, and everything. Of course not. This is more of the idea that one day you have a social organization that exists, and a social organization that need somebody at its top to govern it. And so this is the problem of the state. And for Nietzsche, this is where this political problem is the origin of guilt.
Yeah. So this is the need of those at the top in society, the masters or the aristocrats, needing to kind of subvert those beneath. Yeah. This is kind of what we're getting to. Yeah. This is kind of, it's interesting. In the first essay, we were kind of talking about how this guilt and bad conscience developed in the slave or the plebeian man, whereas here it's more talking about how the masters or aristocrats need to create guilt and bad conscience in the minds of the lower class in order to subvert them and to keep them from exerting their will to power.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. This is something essential about the will to power in Nietzsche. You cannot just
turn it off.
Yeah, you cannot just turn it off. You cannot just
Yeah.
say, "Oh, you will not exert your will to power," because every living animal, every human has a will to power that needs to exert in a certain way. So, if you want the people not to exert the will to power in this very turbulent way that was the norm before living under the state, if you want them to exert it in a more pacific way, you need to learn, you need to find another way to exert it. And this is where bad conscience is very interesting. And this is what Nietzsche called the interiorization of man. Is that the power that you were used to exert against the other, that could be a man, an animal, something else, you just exert toward yourself. So you will express your power not in doing harm to somebody else, not to express your power against somebody else, but against yourself. So the one who is cruel, the one who wants to make somebody suffer, who will be cruel against himself and make himself suffer. And this is the big Nietzsche say that this is how the men were able to live in a society, to use this huge power they had and they were used to exert outwardly, and to turn it into something inward. Or to put it otherwise, maybe, they had a lot of space around them to attack, express themselves, dominate, and everything. And from one day to another, they live in a state they cannot anymore. So what they do, they create this space inside themselves. They create a battlefield inside their head. And this battlefield is bad conscience. It's themselves against themselves. Their animalistic part, their drives, their ancient drives, against the new drive that are needed by the state.
Yeah. Well, and I like that conceptualization of it as well, because it's no longer like me attacking you or me asserting my will to power against you. It's more like my kind of quote unquote higher self asserting it against my like lower self or my animalistic instincts.
And actually it's more complex, because it's not only my we could say like civilized instinct again, my animalistic instincts, because actually your civilized instincts are just your animal instincts turns against themselves. Like,
okay,
you know what
sure,
it's still cruelty, but it's cruelty made more subtle, so that it's cruelty against cruelty itself. Like it's something a bit weird. Like this is really it's a bit hard to conceive, but the main point for Nietzsche is that there's the same pleasure in it, in fact, that the pleasure we took in making somebody suffer, we find it again into this idea of making oneself suffer.
I mean, just speaking kind of personally, I can relate to that. Like, yeah, even something like making myself take a cold shower or something in the morning. Like there's a kind of, it sucks, but there's also a pleasure in it. There's a kind of maybe like sadistic pleasure. Yeah. And do you think Nietzsche would say that pleasure we get in kind of turning our will to power inward, it's a similar kind of like domination? Like we're kind of, we're not dominating another, but we're like kind of dominating a part of ourselves, or like a lesser part of ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we could say it like that.
Okay, yeah.
There's something really different, because you don't have this social pleasure of dominating somebody else and then feel socially...
Right. You're not kind of climbing the hierarchy in any
you're not
way.
climbing the hierarchy, but like... as Nietzsche puts it, there's many reasons why doing harm to somebody was pleasant in some way.
Right.
And this is also something that Nietzsche believes, that punishment was used, especially in the Greeks, for instance, to make the world interesting for the gods. Like the idea was to like the feast you did for the gods were in order to entertain them, and so cruelty against the people were a way to entertain the gods. And what he says also is that when people invented free will, for instance, it gave rise to an inner fight inside yourself between between the angel and the demon, we could say, the good and the bad, which is a never-ending fight. Like if you think about free will, then the world is full of unpredictable things. If you think about the world as totally determined, like as absolute determination, then the world is really boring. So one hypothesis of Nietzsche is that punishment is also here to make the world more interesting for the gods, but in fact also for us. Yeah, you know.
That is interesting. My mind goes into like simulation arguments and stuff, but we won't take it there.
Maybe we can just summarize what we say from now. We say that the aristocrat we have to be sure about that, are not the one who feel bad conscience at the beginning. They are the one that just want to create the state. And so, therefore, they create bad conscience in the slaves. So, later we're going to see that it's more complex, because actually when they create bad conscience in the slaves, they will end feeling bad conscience themselves. So bad conscience will just spread.
And that's a lot of the third essay is Nietzsche talking about how this bad conscience that's originally just in the lower class or in the slaves, becomes they end up infecting everybody in society. So everybody in society then has the bad conscience
because of the priests, notably. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but at the beginning, in what Nietzsche said in the second essay, it's like the aristocrat who are not who have no bad conscience but create bad conscience. But the thing is that we could ask like how they create bad conscience, and this is when the text is a bit confusing, because Nietzsche say they create bad conscience with punishment. So punishment is a way for them to turn the instincts backward. So it's kind of weird. You say, punishment doesn't bring bad conscience, but bad conscience comes from punishment. And we have to be aware of the fact that for Nietzsche, the punishment in itself is kind of nothing. It's just a common name to call a lot of different things. But like what's meaningful is that we're gonna give to punishment a lot of different meanings. Like as we said, punishment could be for many functions in the social order. And for the first time with the aristocrat, punishment will be used in order to create guilt. And this is the main difference.
Yeah.
Like punishment is not the cause of guilt, because punishment doesn't in itself brings guilt automatically. Punishment, as interpreted by the aristocrat in order to make people live in a society, is the cause of guilt. So actually the real cause of guilt is the need for the man to live suddenly in a society and to exert his will to power not in an external way. Mm-hmm. But like now the question is like, how is it possible? Like how can you transform punishment from something that makes guilt impossible, for instance, in making, as we said, like usually punishment avoids guilt. Like it's make the people more tough, it makes the people more intelligent, but not more guilty. How does it become something that makes guilt impossible to something that produces actively guilt?
That's great. Well, you set the stage well to kind of talk about this idea of ancestor worship.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll take a stab at this, and you can kind of critique me if I say anything stupid. But so my understanding is basically a current generation is in a creditor-debtor relationship with their ancestors, in the sense that our ancestors have given us so many things. They've given us all of the technology, all of these medicines, a lot of things that allow us to survive and thrive. And in a way, we kind of owe our lives to our ancestors and all of the generations that came before in order to afford us all of these, luxuries we have. So in a way, we are debtors to our ancestors. And the idea is that each passing generation, this debt grows and grows and grows to the point where the current generation starts to lift their worship of the ancestors to gods, and certain things like sacrificing to the gods is a way of the debtor trying to repay this debt that they feel to the gods. But the idea is that this debt just accrues and accrues. Our past generations have done so much for us, our ancestors have done so much for us, we can never repay this debt. So we start to have this kind of weary feeling that he talks about, which ultimately the solution for it is Christianity, in God as Jesus Christ paying off the loan, in a sense, dying for our sins. That is a way of kind of God as the creditor evening the debt.
Yeah.
All right, so how did I do? Where do we, anything you want to kind of add some nuance to? Yeah.
There's just something, like you said, like, we feel dead for our generation. Actually, we are at the end of the process. We as modern individuals. So we have already been through Christianity. So we already have this idea of God. So we don't really get it, what it is to feel dead for our ancestors. Like we don't give cults for our ancestors or for spirits that symbolize these ancestors. But people did a lot before, like especially before Christianity.
And then is the idea too that this feeling of kind of like original sin is in a way feeling like you're kind of born into debt. Like God in the form of Jesus Christ has already died for the sins. There's no way to kind of repay the debt, so it's just kind of left lingering.
Yeah. I mean, you're in debt, so you cannot repay. So you just hate yourself in a certain way. Or Nietzsche say you can also hate your ancestors, like in a very paradoxical way. Like God is like now the symbol of your ancestor, but you forgot it in some way. Like it's God, you're in debt with God. And so you feel guilty, but you try to put the guilt somewhere. So you accuse Adam, for instance, or Eve. You accuse the first man who committed the first sin. Or you accuse yourself of being a sinner. So yeah, this kind of thing. So so you are in a relation where you are in debt to God and you cannot repay. So there's sin everywhere in somehow. And this is where it's always renewing itself. It's because you're always in debt. Like the debt is too big to be repaid. So you're always in debt. You're always possibly a sinner, and you're even more sinner because actually your debt is already paid by Jesus. Like God sacrificed His Son for your sin. So in fact, you're not supposed to be in debt because God forgives you. God forgives the sinner. That's what Jesus told us. But in a certain way, you owe Him the fact that He repaid your sin. So the debt become more subtle and even less repayable. Like it was already hard to repay the debt because your ancestor became so great over the time and everything. Generation after generation, the God become powerful, even more powerful. So it becomes harder to pay the debt. And at some point, when God Himself pays the debt for you, it's over. Like you're just in debt forever in somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think also the idea too is then that this guilty conscience or this guilty feeling comes from, as the debtor, feeling like you're indebted and either you cannot repay the debt or your creditor is not punishing you and not kind of evening the debt. Because kind of going back to our kind of trivial example, if I, as the creditor, give you $10 and then you don't repay me, again, if I kind of punch you in the face, we're even. But if I just kind of say like, oh, I forgive you, and kind of make you feel guilty about it in a kind of moral way, you're kind of just left with this lingering guilt. And like, I'm kind of in that way making you punish yourself rather than doing.
But this is nice for me because it's only $10. The thing is, like with God, it's the crystallization of hundreds of years of luck and power that was, and health and everything. So in fact, it's like you would give me like billions of dollars.
Sure, yeah.
And I would feel like these people who won the lottery and they don't know what to do for it because it makes no sense and they don't feel they deserve it, and they're like, here it's even worse because you make me feel guilty about it in somehow.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know.
And I mean, along those lines, my mind kind of went to things like having like white guilt or even guilt of kind of the privilege being born into kind of a wealthy family, where it's a similar kind of idea of like you're kind of born with something that you didn't really do anything to deserve. So there's this feeling of indebtedness. that might cause somebody to feel like, oh, I should be punished for this in some way. But if you're not punished, that kind of just lingers as just this guilt.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And that's how bad conscience is made possible. Yeah, so the debt, so it's because the debt becomes spiritual that it is possible to interiorize it.
Yeah.
So it's not only the idea that in order to turn the will to power toward oneself, you had to make it spiritual. Like this is a big thing in Nietzsche. Like, of course, you have some when we think about bad conscience and about self-harm, we think about these crazy monastic people who hurt themselves with sticks and who make themselves blood but this is not what Nietzsche is talking about. This is a more common phenomenon. In the more common phenomenon, punishment came from a physical state to a psychological, spiritual state, and this is how it could be interiorized. And this is through this interiorization that we could live in a society. It's because our desire for cruelty learned to express itself not physically, but inwardly and toward ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and I think of also like the common phrase, somebody saying like, stop beating yourself up about that.
Yeah.
Again, it's like this feeling of guilt. I shouldn't have done that. Again, the free will kind of, I could have done otherwise. I chose the wrong thing. I shouldn't have done this, and I'm kind of beating myself up again, not like with a monk who's swatting themselves with a stick.
The fact that we say beat up is because you feel that it's replacing something like hitting somebody, like
right.
the pleasure.
I deserve to be punished, and nobody else is gonna punish me. So to get rid of this guilt, I need to therefore punish myself. Well, and then let's take a stab now at trying to connect these ideas of the ancestor worship and, this need to, these new needs that occurred at the dawn of civilization. And there's a quote here in chapter 22 that I think connects these ideas. He says, quote, "That will for self-torture, that inverted cruelty of the animal man who turned subjective and scared into introspective, invented the bad conscience so as to hurt himself after the natural outlet for this will to hurt became blocked. In other words, this man of the bad conscience exploited the religious hypothesis so as to carry his martyrdom to the ghastliest pitch of agonized intensity." So I took that to mean basically we have this kind of indebtedness to our ancestors, this kind of original sin, this debt that can never be paid. And we also have this new situation we're in, which is being in civilization. And it's basically, we need to kind of tame our animal instincts through kind of directing our will to power onto ourselves. And like basically we're going to use it through this kind of guilt or indebtedness that we feel to God. Is that kind of kind of how these ideas connect?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I was a bit lost when you said when you formulated it, but I think so. I think it's the point. It's the point. The whole thing is about drawing this energy we had normally in the creditor to debtor relation. There was a social energy, like something against something else, somebody else, and to more and more bring it toward yourself. And in order to do that, which is you need to do that, the fiction of a god is necessary, because this is how you come from a social form of punishment, of a punishment towards somebody else, from a punishment toward yourself. Like you need this idea, you need to disconnect the creditor and the debtor, so that, in fact, in reality, in the real world, in the concrete world, you cannot repay. So your only solution is spiritual, and it's toward yourself. I mean, toward God, but in fact, it's
right.
It's in you, and you could say that God is a way to symbolize your civilized self against your animal safe.
Right.
So self, yeah.
Well, cool. So let's maybe wrap up by talking about Nietzsche's views on bad conscience. And there's this famous quote. At least famous in the sense that every analysis I've seen of this essay brings it up. So I think it's worth talking about. This is in chapter 19. He says, quote, "Undoubtedly, the bad conscience is an illness, but an illness like pregnancy is an illness. Is the idea that the mother is having to sacrifice this kind of illness in order to birth this new baby. In a way, the illness in this metaphor is bad conscience, but the new baby that's being birthed is going to be this sovereign individual who is maybe superior to the blonde beast that came before, because now, unlike the blonde beast, it has conscience, it has the ability to promise.
Yeah, definitely.
And, can be something greater.
Yeah, this is what Nietzsche talks about in the first in the first section of this the second essay. He talks about the sovereign individual. And when you have a very like when I read Nietzsche like a few years ago, I was still astonished by that, because I was like, the sovereign individual for Nietzsche is an individual that is totally domesticated, that can promise because he's become regular. Like, he domesticated the nature within himself so that he can promise, he can be predictable, and so he can promise to other people, and he's sovereign in this sense. He can decide what he wants for himself. So when you have this image of Nietzsche and the blonde beast and everything, you're like, oh, so Nietzsche is in fact evaluating a domesticated animal in a certain way. Oh, that's strange. But actually, no, that's really what Nietzsche means. Like, Nietzsche thinks that in a certain way, the fact of being domesticated at the end should give birth to an individual that is able to affirm itself in a sovereign way. So this is something really, really honorable in some point. And what Nietzsche believes is that in between, the man has to learn to hate himself. Like, all this process of bad conscience is this negative process is just a step toward the sovereign individual. So what Nietzsche hopes is not to come back before bad conscience. It's impossible. Like, we have conscience now. We are self-conscious. We are animals with this bad conscience that with reflexivity and everything. So we cannot go back to the state of the Greek of innocence of I did that, it's because of God. No, we are too much self-aware of why of these questions. So we cannot go back. Like, this would be unrealistic and a bit reactionary in some way. But like, Nietzsche hopes that at the end of the process, there's something like an affirmation. Like an affirmative individual. And the danger for Nietzsche is that we miss this part, and that we stay in the negativity, and that because we take so much pleasure in doing ourselves harm. So it's seeing bad conscience as a stepping stone to something greater, and the fear is that we mistake the stepping stone as the ultimate goal. Yeah, and we keep stuck in this process that actually where we take pleasure in diminishing ourselves. Right? That makes sense, and that kind of helps me tie it together as well. Yeah. Well, cool, man. This was great. Yeah, lots to think about. Yeah, definitely. Lots to think about next time I'm feeling guilty. I don't know if reading this piece will make me feel better, but it'll definitely give some understanding and some intellectual curiosity. Well, thank you for this second part. Cool, man. Thanks. Thank you. Hey, this is Zach. Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, be sure to follow it so that you get notified every time I release an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd really appreciate if you could take a few seconds to rate the show. This really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover it. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to books and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.